Everyone's as dressed up as I am. I like this. This is a nice audience. That's good to be here, and great to hear Michael's comments. I want to thank all of you for taking an interest in a subject that falls outside of the standard Washington talking point menu, at least as of now, but which is going to be highly relevant to our future. And frankly, I'm grateful to President Trump for being the first president in modern history that has taken a serious interest in the future of really all of the sectors in the future, but including Bitcoin and the future of related crypto policies. And I think that part of the golden age for America will be a golden age of not just Bitcoin, but thoughtfulness about our approach to the future of Bitcoin. And that's part of what the Bitcoin Policy Institute is opening up today, is dialogue around an important subject that we, I think, have not yet wrapped our heads around as policymakers. And I want to say thank you for the invitation today. It's why I wanted to be here. Now, I'm going to approach this discussion from a little different lens than Michael, whose tail end of remarks I just heard. I think he did a fantastic job. A little different than the standard case you might hear for the accumulation of a Bitcoin strategic reserve or stockpile. You could define these terms differently. That's a little bit more generalizable. It's not grounded on a bullish view on Bitcoin, though I do happen to own Bitcoin and I'm bullish on Bitcoin. It doesn't have to do with even thinking about the national strategic position of the United States, as you just heard from Michael Saylor, and I agree with a lot of what he said. But it's a different vantage point altogether, grounded in the principle of capital discipline. I'll tell you what I mean. For the last decade and a half, we have operated in an era of easy money. This isn't a controversial statement to make. We have lived in an era of money raining from on high, like the Federal Reserve, like manna coming from heaven, or sometimes, as I might have described it, showering a room full of cocaine addicts with cocaine. And what that has done is it has suspended the usual conditions of decision-making by any institution, by a federal government, by a state government, by a corporation, by a nonprofit, by a foundation. Usually these institutions operate under conditions of capital scarcity. And there's a complicated way of just explaining what I'm about to describe. I'm going to go with the simpler way. I have an old principle that said that if you can't explain it to a ninth grader, you probably don't understand it yourself. So we're going to go with the simple way today. Under conditions of capital scarcity, an institution has to make a choice of how it allocates its capital. Do I spend it on project A, or do I spend it on project B because my resources are finite? Perhaps that is a biotech or pharmaceutical company. It's my background as an entrepreneur before I entered the field of public life. Am I going to spend it on this particular drug for, endometriosis, or am I going to spend it on this particular other alternative drug for the treatment of a rare genetic disease? Perhaps it's where you might expend your resources as an energy company. Am I going to explore for more oil and gas here, or am I going to spend more on a refinery project over here? It's the basic questions of capital allocation under times of scarcity. What happened over the last 15 years and the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis and the low interest rate policies that persisted for about a decade and a half is that capital effectively became free to everybody because of the policies adopted not only by the US Federal Reserve, but by central banks around the world. Under conditions of capital scarcity, you no longer have to decide between project A and B because functionally, you can just pursue both of them at the same time. Now that led, particularly in the case of government behavior, to a level of overspending, government overspending, that created the inflation that began to kick in over the last couple of years, which instead then created a different response from the Federal Reserve and likely from other central banks around the world to raise interest rates and to exit the period of infinite capital for each of these institutions. And so what's going to happen, in the same way that we had a persistent period of infinite capital, of the absence of capital scarcity, we're now going to enter a new, and I believe even more persistent era of scarce capital once again. It's going to have a disciplining effect on every institution, from the private sector to the public. And that means that institutions, from nonprofits to companies to state governments to a federal government, are going to have to reconsider, what is my hurdle rate for a given project? What is my opportunity cost of capital? Where else could I be parking this money? At what rate of return? And to compare that to the internal rate of return on a different project that I might pursue. As I said, I'm going to give you the simple version of this. In the simple version of the world, I would break it down into two categories of projects that a company, a nonprofit, a state government, or a national government could pursue. We'll consider areas of low-risk capital investment and areas of high-risk capital investment. Now, of course, this two-category model is false. It's a continuously varying spectrum of risk, but for the purpose of simplicity, consider it this way. There's low-risk, let's say you're a company. There's a low-risk project you could pursue and a high-risk project you could pursue. What ought to be your hurdle rate of return for a low-risk project that you consider as a corporation? The default is a U.S. Treasury. You can think about the duration, 3 months, 10-year, whatever it is. Right now, 10-year U.S. Treasuries are yielding what? Somewhere between, give or take over the course of the next year, 4 to 5%. That's your hurdle rate of return. To say that as a company, I'm sitting on a stockpile of cash, I could just put it in a safe, functionally, we hope it is, risk-free instrument for the long run and collect 4 to 5%. So if I'm going to take on a different project internally, even a low-risk project at my company or my nonprofit or my institution, it better earn more than 4 to 5%, or else I would rather just leave it parked in the low-risk instrument. That creates, again, a hurdle rate for risk-adjusted return that we didn't have under conditions of infinite capital over the last 15 years. This is a new calculus that's really been traditionally the business decision that people have had to make for time immemorial. That's back now, again, in the United States. What about for your hurdle rate for a higher risk project? That's really the question at issue. There isn't today a clear standard for what your hurdle rate ought to be. There's a lot of mumbo jumbo in financial theory about, well, it should be the LIBOR or the US 10-year Treasury rate plus some arbitrarily derived rate of return, plus 5%, plus 500 points or whatever it is. It's really just economic mumbo jumbo. I mean, I come from even the world in biotech investing and biotech capital allocation. People make up what the opportunity cost is for the rate of return. I believe that in the next 10 to 15 years, in the new era of scarce capital, where we are in need of institutions in need of identifying what their hurdle rate of return is going to be, for low-risk projects, it is and ought to be the 10-year Treasury yield. But for higher-risk projects that any company or any other institution contemplates, I believe the expected long-run rate of return on Bitcoin will set the hurdle rate for internal capital investment. And the reasons why are clear because they're tied to the inherent attributes of Bitcoin itself. It has a fixed supply defined by a mathematical formula. As I've often said in other contexts, God is real, math is math, and pretty much everything else is negotiable, at least subject to change over time. Think about alternative hurdles of what you might use as your rate of return, even other commodities, even gold. We could think about the supply as really being variable over a long enough time horizon, the amount of gold we might discover on planet Earth. In an era of interplanetary exploration, sounds like kooky stuff to talk about, but just think about it very pragmatically as we eventually at least reach and eventually maybe even colonize other planets. I believe it is more likely than not that we will discover large reserves of gold, AU, on the periodic table, same as we will of other elements on other planets as well. The supply of gold, let alone even the cost of storing it, are unlikely to be fixed. You're not going to find Bitcoin on another planet because it's not defined by the laws of nature, which our understanding of them continues to evolve and change anyway. It's defined by the laws of math, on which our understanding of it does not change over time because it is fixed in a way that's not subject to changing constraints in the natural world. So back to the question of when you think about what ought to be your hurdle rate of return for higher risk projects as a company, as a nonprofit, as a state government or a federal government, I believe we're going to see the emergence of Bitcoin in a way that we haven't in the last 10 years. Why haven't we seen it in the last 10 years? Because we haven't needed hurdle rates in the first place. We haven't needed hurdle rates for low-risk projects. We haven't needed hurdle rates for higher-risk projects. That is now rapidly changing. Now, against the backdrop of what I've laid out, you could ask the question of, why have you limited this to be a hurdle rate of return for higher-risk projects than for lower-risk projects? Shouldn't Bitcoin just be the hurdle rate of return for everything, period, rather than the U.S. Treasury? And this is where, I guess I would draw on one of my experiences is if you care about somebody, you tell them the truth, and if you care about yourself, you tell them what they want to hear. I care about this community, and I consider myself part of it. I'm going to give you my perspective of the truth. And sometimes we get a little bit ahead of our skis in the Bitcoin world or the pro-Bitcoin world, in that right now we're not operating against a backdrop of where any institution really, or say for a really small number of institutions, we just heard from Michael Saylor, so I can't say no institutions, but almost no institutions have adopted or tethered any component of their hurdle rate of capital return to the Bitcoin standard. We're not going to a world where it is automatically tomorrow going to be, now that's going to be the sole rate of return that we're going to compare any other project to. 10-year treasuries are going to be the standard for assessing low-risk allocations of capital. But I think it would be a seismic step forward, and I think it is going to be a seismic step forward to say that even though the volatility of an asset like Bitcoin is obviously much greater than that of US treasuries, so too has been the rate of return on Bitcoin over the course of the last 10 years compared to those treasuries. For the higher risk, higher return stratum of where you measure what your hurdle rate is for your rate of return on a project, I believe Bitcoin will emerge as that new standard. And if you believe that, as I do, I think that makes for probably the most compelling case for any institution, governmental to non-governmental, to for-profit to non-profit, holding some level of a reserve of Bitcoin. It helps to be bullish on it for the long run because you believe that asset's going to appreciate. But what it does is it tethers your institution's behavior under conditions of capital scarcity to something of fixed supply that has a fixed store of value that's likely to go up over the course of time. That is a different case for actually holding Bitcoin, even if you're a corporation. So we're talking about this at the level of the national stockpile or the national strategic reserve. But sometimes the case becomes clearer if you even look at it in the case of a company. If your company's sitting on a stockpile of cash, you're going to hold a lot of it. A lot of them do today in the form of US treasuries. Very few of them are holding those reserves in the form of Bitcoin today. I believe that is likely to change. Why do I believe it's likely to change? I believe over time, companies and institutions tend to do what they should do, and if they don't, others are going to do the same thing and outcompete them out of business. This is where I'm actually intrigued and proud of where one of the companies that I founded, called Strive, has actually played an early role in beginning to help catalyze that change. Strive was a firm I founded several years ago to push back against ESG overreach in capital markets. And what you saw in corporate America was many companies were in that realm adopting policies that were hostile to their own self-interest. Energy companies producing less oil and gas, even under times where it would have been more profitable to do so in the name of environmental mandates. And what Strive did at that time, I give this to you as backdrop for what I'm about to tell you, was vote proxies on behalf of the assets that it managed in boardrooms of these companies, affecting the behavior in these boardrooms, against those ESG policies in favor of whatever policies maximized actual overall value for that corporation. At the time we began and embarked on that project, it was unthinkable that we would be where we are today, where peak ESG is in the rearview mirror just a few years later. A lot of that private sector efficiency, closing the inefficiency gaps, they closed far more quickly than you'd ever expect from the benefit of the vantage point of a rearview mirror and the benefit of retrospect. I think we're going to see the same thing with respect to the corporate stockpiling of Bitcoin. Strive actually recently became one of the few, if not only institutional asset managers, certainly one of the few, that voted in favor of a shareholder proposal at Microsoft to be able to put Bitcoin on its balance sheet. And that feels to me about as contrarian today as it did several years ago to vote against the ESG policies in the boardrooms of companies like Exxon and Chevron. And as unthinkable as it was that ESG would be in the rearview mirror then, how quickly we saw that change catalyzed, I think that's what we're likely to be saying a few years from now, looking at just the normalization of companies saying that obviously now in an era of no longer free capital, we have to rethink what our hurdle rates of return actually are from projects that go from low risk to high risk. And so on the front end of change, it's often hard to imagine what that change looks like. It often seems daunting, impossible, or you imagine time horizons that are measured in decades rather than years. And then in retrospect, what you realize is if that was obvious, if it was actually grounded in truth, things tend to happen far more quickly than we actually anticipate. And so the thing that we ought to debate isn't the time horizon over which it happens, but the validity of the argument of whether or not the underlying proposition is true. And I think we ought to have room for reasonable debate about this. Somebody might make, what's the best possible counter-argument to the view that I've shared here? I try to think about that, otherwise you don't really understand what you believe. One argument could be, no, we should just put it in the S&P 500. That's your opportunity cost for your rate of return. Well, if you're a company that is in the S&P 500 or aspires to be, that has a certain kind of circularity to it, right? Because you think of yourself as allocating your capital to a certain opportunity cost of return on your capital in a way that's different from and diversified from the underlying risk of the projects that you're evaluating. It doesn't quite make sense to put it in that same asset class that you yourself are comprising and a part of. At the same time, it doesn't make sure to put it in 10-year US Treasury yields. It's still being 4 to 5%. For the higher risk opportunity cost of capital that you're measuring against your internal rate of return on your project, 4 to 5% isn't going to cut it either. So I think you could take the same, try it on like a set of clothes for each of the alternative asset classes. And I think in the end, you're left with a less compelling case than you have for an asset class that is now here to stay, that has a demonstrated history, now measured in decades rather than years, and has the attribute of a fixed, mathematically defined supply, a characteristic that even gold doesn't share. And by the way, gold used to historically be that hurdle rate for that opportunity cost of capital for institutions holding gold in their reserves. That's why I believe that it's going to be, I can't tell you when it's going to be, whether it's going to be next month or next year. I don't think it's going to be the next decade that you begin to see more private sector institutions, nonprofits and corporations included, holding their own reserves, call them stockpiles or reserves of Bitcoin in their own treasury. And I think that is going to happen even sooner than you see sovereigns actually adopting the same, both states, nations, and including our own. And the reason I say that is usually you see the sovereign behavior follow that direction in which the private sector is already headed on its own. One of the things I've learned is politicians, they tend to be followers, not leaders. I do think we have an exception right now in the White House of a guy who is a business leader that happens to be serving as the US president. So we do live in an exceptional era in the United States right now. But as a general rule of thumb, I think people in Washington, D.C., I don't mean this as a slight, it's just a pattern of how history tends to work, take their cues from the private sector. Funny, people even look at decisions or bold decisions that were made, like Brown versus Board of Education, 9-0 Supreme Court decision that ended segregation in our schools. The little left out fact of that, even in the narratives here in DC, is that was already, desegregation was already trending. It was already a horse that had left the barn. All the DC, in this case not policymaker, but court, came in with a unanimous decision to do was to put a stamp, its imprimatur, to finalize a trend that was already inescapably and irreversibly underway in America. Now, to bring it back to the realm from civil rights and desegregation to the realm of Bitcoin and financial markets, I think we're actually going to see basically the same thing in the realm that we're here to talk about today, is that private institutions, under this condition of capital scarcity, the renewed conditions, I should say, the normalized conditions even of capital scarcity, are going to take their cues from private sector actors that look themselves in the mirror and ask themselves, to be competitive, they have to now make decisions again based on what the opportunity cost of capital is or isn't. And it will only be the natural extension of that, the natural and unavoidable consequence that nations and states follow suit in making the same kinds of decisions for themselves. So that was a bit of a technocratic or rather dry case, if I may say, for why I believe we ought to have a strategic stockpile, reserve, whatever you want to call it. These names can be used interchangeably. They have different connotations. Is not just a Bitcoin to the moon mantra, although that might be a little more arousing. And I could give you that version of it. But I think the real reason is grounded in just first principles of how an institution ought to make decisions under conditions of capital scarcity, as we require hurdle rates for return. And my prediction, not always right about these things, but my prediction is that you're actually going to see the private sector move more quickly in this direction, could be quite quickly in this direction, sooner than you actually see sovereigns move. But very quickly thereafter, the sovereigns will line up and follow suit in a way that seems unthinkable today, but in retrospect, a few years from now, will seem the obvious consequence of the conditions and the era that we were in, much as we saw in the evolution and devolution away from ESG. I'll close. I'm going to violate a rule I usually apply in these speeches. Is the advice I give for people asking me for advice on giving an effective speech is you make one point, make it well, and then get off stage before your time is up. My time is effectively up, and I already made my 1 point, but I'm going to violate my rule anyway and just here make a second point anyhow, because I think this one is also important. In some sense, it has nothing to do with Bitcoin. And in another sense, I think it has everything to do with Bitcoin. I think we live in a moment in our national history where there is a question confronting us that we are still yet to answer decisively. It's the question of who we are as Americans. We're a disparate people spread across a vast geographic expanse, bound together by what exactly? It's a question of our time. We don't have a common religion. We don't have a common race or ethnicity. These are things that bind most nations together, a common genetic lineage, a common heritage. That's not us. Never has been, certainly isn't today. What is it that binds us together across those different, diverse attributes? I believe it is a common creed, an ethos that binds us together as Americans. It is an ethos captured in the Declaration of Independence that set the country into motion 250 years ago. It is an ethos actualized, concretized in the U.S. Constitution, which I view as the greatest operating manual for a nation in human history. But it's more than just what the words are in the Constitution or the technical operating strictures of our founding documents. It is an ethos that says that no matter who you are or where you came from or what your skin color is or where your parents came from, that you have an opportunity to be your own hero in the American landscape without any government or bureaucracy standing in your way. You could be a hero as a businessman. You could be a hero as an entrepreneur. You could be a hero as a national leader at the White House to a governor's mansion. You could also be a hero by being a cop or a police officer or a parent or a teacher or a dutiful son or daughter taking care of his elder parent in a nursing home, or somebody who just works hard for your family as a plumber and allows yourself to be the breadwinner for a family that gives your kids the American dream that's a better one than you had. That's what America is at our best. We're a nation founded on the freedom of every individual, no matter what your God-given gift is, distinct from every other person in the world, to use that unique God-given attribute to achieve the maximum of your potential in this country without a government or bureaucracy standing in your way. That, I believe, is who we are at our core. And we as human beings, we need the symbols that remind us of that from time to time. It is what I believe is in part codified in the symbology of the American flag right behind me here today. I think we live in a moment where we have lost those hero narratives, where those hero narratives for the next generation of aspiring heroes are missing. I believe that's what accounts for the growing epidemic of depression, anxiety, fentanyl, suicide. And against that backdrop, I don't want to oversell this or overbuild this up, but I think there's a role to recognize that ethos of America and the way in which that at least overlaps with the ethos of Bitcoin as well. I think Bitcoin and what it represents, more than as a financial asset, also helps fill that void, fill that hunger for a symbol, a reminder of what American greatness was all about. And I think it makes that in the national context an even more fitting asset to fill our national stockpiles and national strategic reserves with something that not only, most importantly, has the financial attributes that I laid out earlier, but even more importantly for the long run, also in a moment where we lack the symbols of reminding ourselves and our next future generations of who we are, helps to fill that void by embracing capitalism rather than apologizing for it, by embracing success rather than victimhood. We're victors, not victims. That's who we are. And as much as I believe that's the American creed, that'd be the creed that I would like to see embodied in the future of Bitcoin And I'll close with this, also the policies that are set surrounding not only the future of Bitcoin, but more generally, the future of crypto policy in America. I don't want to see us fall into a trap where we make the very mistakes in regulating and constraining and use crony capitalism to weed out and eliminate competitors. That's what you see in other industries. That's what you see through all of the course of human history and its interface between business and government. I think what makes the future of Bitcoin, and I'm not going to conflate them, but more broadly the future of crypto policy interesting and important, is that if the ethos of Bitcoin and the ethos of the character of the asset class we're talking about today is distinct and embodies the American spirit, then I want to make sure that we here in America don't adopt some of the same cronyist or market limiting or competition limiting forces that have tempted us in other regulated industries to use our future policy framework in the future of Bitcoin and crypto policy more generally to embrace those principles of freedom and competition without apology. And I offer that both as hopefully a note of inspiration as well as a note of caution as we enter what I believe is a new golden age, not just for America, but a new golden age for innovation in America. And I do believe that Bitcoin will be a critical and important part of it. Thank you for having me today, guys. God bless you and our great country. And come visit Ohio. I appreciate it. Thank you.